Ethan Thompson stepped out of his apartment building into the crisp New York morning air. The city was already awake, buzzing with the usual sounds of honking cars, hurried pedestrians, and street vendors setting up for the day. But for Ethan, there was no rush. At 72, retirement had gifted him the luxury of slow mornings. He took a deep breath, savoring the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting from Ella's cafe just around the corner. It was a morning ritual he'd maintained for years. Ella's cafe had been a neighborhood staple for decades, though ownership had changed a few times. Despite the transitions, the place had kept its charm. An intimate seating area, the warm scent of pastries wafting through the air, and the friendly faces of staff who knew Ethan well. As he stepped inside, the little bell above the door jingled, and Ella, the owner, waved at him from behind the counter. "Morning, Mr. Thompson. The usual?" she asked with a smile. "You know me too well, Ella," Ethan replied with a grin, heading to his favorite booth in the back. Ella le sirvió un tazón humeante de café negro y le puso un muffin de arándano azul fresco en su plato. "Retirement treating you well?" she asked as she leaned casually against the counter. "Can't complain, though I do miss the kids sometimes," Ethan said with a small chuckle, stirring his coffee. He had spent over 40 years as a high school teacher, molding young minds and helping students find their way. Many of his former students still kept in touch, sending him notes of appreciation from time to time. Teaching had been his life, and it was hard to let go. But after decades in the classroom, he knew when it was time to step away. Ethan unfolded his newspaper and began scanning the headlines, letting the sounds of the cafe wash over him. Most of the other patrons were glued to their phones or laptops, but Ethan preferred the quiet ritual of reading a physical newspaper. He enjoyed the tactile nature of it, turning the pages slowly, savoring the silence. "Mr. Thompson?" A voice broke through his concentration. Ethan looked up to see Chris, one of his former students. Now in his 30s, Chris stood in front of him with a wide grin. "Chris, look at you!" Ethan exclaimed, standing up to shake his hand. "How's everything going?" "I'm good, Mr. Thompson," Chris replied, his smile widening. "I still remember your history lessons. You always found a way to make everything relatable, like with your sports analogies." Ethan chuckled. "Hey, whatever works to get you to understand, right?" The two sat down together, catching up over coffee. Chris, now a real estate agent, shared updates about his life. Ethan listened intently, proud of the man Chris had become. They talked about the old days, his history classes, the way Ethan made learning memorable, and how Chris had applied those lessons in his own life. "You always told us to stand up for what's right," Chris said after a while. "That's stuck with me. I try to do that every day." Ethan nodded, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. "I'm glad to hear that." Chris checked his watch and stood up. "I've got to run, but we should grab lunch sometime soon." "Anytime," Ethan replied with a warm smile. As Chris left, Ethan watched him go. A sense of pride filled his chest. He had spent his life shaping young minds, and moments like this reminded him that his work had been worthwhile. He finished his coffee, folded his newspaper, and left a generous tip on the table. "See you tomorrow, Ella," he said, standing up. "Take care, Mr. Thompson," Ella called after him, wiping her hands on her apron. Ethan adjusted his scarf as he stepped outside into the cool morning. He started his usual walk home, taking the familiar route down Oak Street, left on 56th, then a right on Birch Avenue. It was a peaceful walk, one he had taken hundreds of times over the years. But today, for reasons he couldn't yet know, his usual route would take an unexpected turn. Ethan had just stepped outside the cafe, savoring the crisp morning air, when he heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to find Chris walking toward him with a bright smile on his face. "You're fast," Ethan remarked, noticing Chris had caught up to him so quickly. "I thought you were in a hurry." "I was," Chris chuckled, his grin widening. "But then I realized I hadn't checked in with you in a while. Thought I'd walk with you for a bit." Ethan smiled warmly, pleased with the unexpected company. "Well, I'd appreciate the company. It's nice to have a little chat after coffee." The two walked side by side, the city bustling around them. Pedestrians hurried past and cars zoomed by in the busy morning traffic. Yet despite the chaos of New York, there was something comforting about these moments, the kind of calm that only time could offer. "You know," Chris said, breaking the silence after a few steps. I still remember your class like it was yesterday. All those history lessons, but especially the way you tie everything back to sports. That's what helped me really get into it. Ethan chuckled. You'd be surprised how much history is like a good sports game. A lot of strategy, a little unpredictability, and sometimes it's all about the underdog. I'll never forget the way you compared the fall of the Roman Empire to a game of football, Chris said with a laugh. It made so much sense to me then. You made history relatable. Ethan smiled. He had always tried to find ways to make history connect with his students, and sports had always been his go-to analogy. I guess that's the key, teaching in a way that clicks. They walked a few more steps before Chris added, You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about the lessons you taught us. Not just about history, but about standing up for what's right. I don't think I realized it at the time, but those lessons are why I try to do the right thing now, every day. Ethan looked at him, a hint of pride in his eyes. I'm glad to hear that, Chris. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you long after you leave the classroom. Chris nodded thoughtfully. I try to live by it, in my work, in my life. It's not always easy, but I know it's worth it. They walked in companionable silence for a few more minutes, heading in the direction of Ethan's apartment. It was moments like these brief exchanges with his former students, that filled Ethan with a quiet sense of pride. He had shaped so many lives over the years, and seeing them grow into thoughtful, successful individuals was a reminder that his work had been meaningful. Chris paused as they neared the intersection where they would part ways. Well, I'd better get going. Got a few things to take care of. But lunch soon, yeah? You name the time, Ethan replied, giving Chris a friendly slap on the back. Thanks, Mr. Thompson. I'll reach out soon. Ethan watched Chris walk away, a proud smile tugging at his lips. He had always believed in his students, even when they didn't fully understand the importance of the lessons he taught them. But moments like this, when they returned to him years later, showed him that his efforts had not been in vain. As he continued walking toward home, Ethan's heart felt light. It had been a small conversation, just a brief catch-up, but it reminded him of the impact he had made over the years. The path ahead felt familiar, but for some reason today, it felt a little brighter. Ethan continued his walk down the familiar streets of the neighborhood, enjoying the peace and quiet that always accompanied his morning strolls. The cool air was refreshing, and the rhythmic sound of his footsteps on the pavement was comforting. As he neared the intersection of 56th and Birch Avenue, he noticed a police cruiser parked near the curb. He didn't think much of it. After all, the neighborhood had always been safe, and the police officers who patrolled the area were usually just a presence, not a source of concern. However, as he walked past the cruiser, he noticed the two officers sitting inside. Their eyes followed him as he passed, an unsettling feeling settling in his stomach. He tried to brush it off, thinking it was just his imagination. But then, without warning, he heard one of the officers call out to him. Hey, sir, hold up for a minute. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart rate picking up ever so slightly. He turned around slowly, his palms slightly sweating. The two officers had gotten out of the car and were now standing a few feet away from him. Both were young, perhaps in their late 20s, and they didn't look like they had any particular reason to stop him. Still, the way they were looking at him made him uneasy. Can I help you, officers? Ethan asked, keeping his voice steady, though a hint of confusion laced his words. We got a call about a suspicious person in the area, the first officer, whose name tag read Officer Johnson, said, eyeing Ethan up and down. You match the description. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the sudden and vague accusation. A suspicious person? He repeated. I'm just walking home from the cafe, enjoying my morning coffee. The second officer, Officer Miller, who had a stern expression, folded his arms across his chest. Mind telling us where you live? Ethan's calm demeanor wavered slightly. I live a few blocks from here. Been living in this neighborhood for over 40 years. The officers exchanged a glance, but neither of them moved. Ethan's gut instinct told him something wasn't right. He had never been stopped by the police in all his years living here, and yet now, for no apparent reason, he was being treated as a criminal. Officers, is there a reason I'm being stopped? Ethan asked, his voice now firmer. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just going home. Officer Johnson narrowed his eyes, clearly skeptical. "We're just following up on a call. You match the description." Ethan felt a rising sense of frustration. He wasn't sure what had triggered this encounter, but he knew he had done nothing to deserve this kind of treatment. He stood tall, trying to stay composed. "I don't know what kind of call you got, but this is ridiculous. I'm just an old man on his way home." Officer Miller stepped a little closer, his gaze sharp. "You got any ID on you?" Ethan hesitated for a brief moment. He didn't have to show them his identification. He knew his rights. But he also knew that arguing with the police, especially in a situation like this, could quickly escalate, and he had heard enough stories in the news to understand how things could go terribly wrong. He sighed, his fingers gripping his wallet as he pulled it out. "Here," he said, his voice calm but tight, handing over his ID. Officer Johnson snatched the ID from his hand, scrutinizing it as if it would reveal something more sinister than the name on the card. Ethan's mind raced. He had spent his entire life doing right by others, never in trouble with the law, and yet here he was, being treated as a suspect without cause. After what felt like an eternity, Officer Johnson finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Thompson, huh?" he said, like the name itself might mean something. "You live around here?" "I've lived here for over 4 decades, Ethan replied, his patience wearing thin. "I'm just trying to go home." The officers exchanged another look, clearly unsatisfied but unsure how to proceed. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized the situation wasn't going to end anytime soon. He had been stopped by the police, simply for walking down the street. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the unjust treatment he had read about in the news. Stories of black men being harassed or worse, all for just existing in a public space. The tension between Ethan and the officers was palpable as they stood there scrutinizing him. He could feel the knot tightening in his stomach, but he kept his posture calm, his mind racing. This was no longer just a routine stop. The officers had already made up their minds about him, and that was all it took to turn this into something much more dangerous. As the silence stretched on, Ethan's grip tightened on his wallet. He knew his rights, and he knew that he didn't have to submit to this kind of treatment. But he also knew how easily these situations could escalate. He'd seen it happen too many times in the news, heard about it from friends and family. He had to remain in control. One of the officers, Officer Miller, stepped even closer, invading Ethan's personal space. The officer's breath was heavy with authority, and Ethan's body instinctively tensed. "You got anything on you we should know about?" Officer Miller asked, his voice flat, as if it were a simple question. Ethan frowned. "Like what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though his patience was beginning to fray. "Weapons? Drugs?" Officer Johnson chimed in, his tone more accusatory now. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I'm just coming from the cafe. You can ask Ella herself. I'm not carrying anything." But the officers weren't satisfied. They exchanged another look, one that spoke volumes about their determination to press forward with this charade. Johnson took a step toward Ethan. "Mind if we check?" Ethan froze. This was it, the moment where things could take a dangerous turn. He had seen too many stories, too many names, people who were stopped, questioned, searched, and sometimes even worse, all because of assumptions made about them. Ethan was no fool. He knew that refusing a search could mean an escalation, and he didn't trust these officers to de-escalate anything. "I do mind," Ethan said firmly. "You have no reason to search me. I haven't done anything wrong." Johnson smirked, as if Ethan's defiance was a challenge. "Why so defensive, old man?" he sneered, stepping even closer. Ethan's fists clenched by his sides. His heart was pounding, but he kept his voice steady. "Because you have no cause. I've been living in this neighborhood for 40 years. You have no right to treat me like this." Miller, who had been silent until now, looked at his partner and then at Ethan, his discomfort growing. "Maybe we should let him go," Miller muttered, just loud enough for Ethan to hear. But Johnson wasn't backing down. "No," he snapped. "We still haven't confirmed anything. We can take him in for questioning if we have to." Ethan's chest tightened at the words. Take him in. He knew the implications. A simple walk home, a moment of peaceful reflection, was turning into something more sinister. He wasn't some criminal, some threat. But these officers weren't seeing him for who he was. They saw him only as an assumption, a stereotype. As the officer's words lingered in the air, Ethan's mind raced. He had to stay calm. He had to stay in control. His fingers brushed his phone, which was tucked into his coat pocket. Without missing a beat, he reached for it, pulling it out slowly, making sure the officers saw. He wasn't sure if it was the right move, but it felt like his best option. "Who you calling?" Officer Johnson scoffed, narrowing his eyes. He didn't know what was coming. Ethan didn't respond. He simply tapped the screen and lifted the phone to his ear. After a moment of silence, the phone rang twice before a clear, authoritative voice answered. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was steady, but his mind was racing. "Olivia, I need you to listen carefully. I'm being stopped by two officers who think I matched the description of a suspicious person. I told them I'm just walking home, but now they want to search me without cause." On the other end of the line, Olivia Whitaker's voice was ice cold with authority. "Put me on speakerphone." Ethan complied, turning the screen toward the officers. Johnson and Miller exchanged a confused glance, unsure of what was happening. "This is Olivia Whitaker," her voice rang out, clear and firm. "I'm a senior official with the U.S. Department of Justice. I need both of you to state your names, badge numbers, and the justification for stopping my father." The shift in the officer's demeanor was immediate. The tension in the air thickened as both men seemed to realize that this was no longer just a routine stop. It was a mistake. Johnson's expression faltered, but he didn't immediately back down. "We got a call about a suspicious person. This man matches the description." "Suspicious person?" Olivia's voice carried a dangerous edge. "What description?" Johnson hesitated. We received a call about someone fitting his description acting suspiciously in the area." Ethan didn't miss the way his daughter's tone turned colder. "My father is a 72-year-old retired teacher. He's dressed in a wool coat, carrying nothing but a newspaper and his wallet. Do you really think that's suspicious?" The officers stood there, their defiance slowly draining away, replaced by uncertainty. Miller, now clearly uneasy, took a step back. Johnson, still stubborn, tried to argue. "We're just following up on the call." "No, you're harassing my father based on nothing," Olivia interrupted, her voice steely and unwavering. The standoff seemed to last forever, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. Ethan stood still, his phone in hand, as Olivia's voice rang out in full force. The officers, now visibly on edge, exchanged glances, but neither made a move. Johnson's face had turned a shade of red as he fumbled with his words, trying to regain control of the situation. "Do you really want to keep going with this?" Olivia's voice came through, sharp and commanding. "My father is simply walking home. Do you want me to escalate this further?" Johnson hesitated, clearly rattled by the authority in Olivia's voice. But before he could speak, a new voice cut through the tense silence. "What the hell is going on here?" A higher-ranking officer, an older man whose name tag read Lieutenant Harris, appeared from the crowd that had begun to gather. His eyes quickly scanned the situation. Ethan standing still, phone to his ear, the officers looking increasingly uncomfortable. Harris pushed through the small crowd, his sharp gaze landing on Johnson and Miller. "Explain yourselves," Harris demanded, his voice booming. "We received a call about a suspicious person," Johnson said quickly, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "This man matches the description." Harris didn't miss a beat. "I heard everything," he said, his eyes now fixed on Ethan. "Let him go." The crowd that had started to gather was murmuring in disbelief, some people filming the incident on their phones. Ethan stood still, his breath steady, but his hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline that had coursed through him. He couldn't believe what was happening. The violation, the unjustified suspicion. He'd almost been detained for simply existing. "Let him go," Harris repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Johnson seemed to falter for a moment, but Miller quickly stepped back, his face full of regret. Without another word, Johnson loosened his grip on Ethan's arm and stepped away. Ethan straightened, trying to maintain his composure, but the frustration and fear that had been bubbling beneath the surface finally started to surface. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm, looking at Lieutenant Harris. "I've done nothing wrong." Harris nodded, his eyes softer now. "You're free to go, sir." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He turned and began to walk away, his pace steady, but his mind racing. Behind him, the crowd was still murmuring, some offering him quiet words of support as he passed by. He felt a quiet sense of vindication, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That evening, as Ethan sat in his recliner, his phone buzzed on the table next to him. He picked it up to see that it was Olivia. He tapped the screen to answer. "Dad, are you okay?" Olivia's voice was softer now, but he could hear the steel beneath it. She was fighting for him, fighting for justice, and he knew she would never let this slide. "I'm fine," Ethan replied, though he knew it wasn't completely true. "But I'm glad you stepped in. That could have gone very differently." "You're lucky it didn't," Olivia said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I've already spoken with the mayor. The officers involved are being placed on administrative leave. This is far from over, Dad." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. "I know. It's not just about me, is it?" "No," Olivia's voice softened. "It's about everyone. All the people who don't have someone like me to call. All the people who don't make it out of situations like that. This is bigger than just one bad day." Ethan exhaled slowly. "I never wanted to be part of this fight, Liv. I just wanted to walk home." "I know, Dad," she said quietly, "but now we're going to make sure that something changes." The next day, the media coverage began. News stations were running reports about the incident, calling it out for what it was, racial profiling. Ethan's name was now in the headlines, but it wasn't just about him. The outcry was growing. People were demanding accountability, and the conversation was shifting towards systemic reform. Ethan's phone rang constantly with calls and messages from former students, friends, and even strangers, all expressing their support. But the most important call came later in the day, when Olivia informed him that a press conference would be held the next morning. It was time to make the injustice visible, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever experienced something similar. The next morning, Ethan stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie carefully. It had been a long time since he had worn a suit, but today it felt like the right thing to do. Today, he wasn't just a retired teacher. He was a voice for the countless others who had been silenced by the system. "Olivia, I'm ready," Ethan said into the phone, his voice steady. "I'm with you, Dad," Olivia replied. "We're going to make sure they hear us." At the press conference, Ethan stood next to Olivia, surrounded by reporters, cameras flashing, and protesters holding signs demanding justice. The mayor spoke first, condemning the actions of the officers and promising to implement new policies. When Olivia took the podium, she spoke with authority, but her words were laced with personal conviction. "My father is a man of integrity. He has spent his life teaching, shaping minds. Yesterday, he was stopped and questioned for no reason other than the color of his skin. This is not just about him. This is about everyone who has faced the same injustice, the same discrimination. It stops now." When it was Ethan's turn, he spoke simply, but with deep conviction. "I've spent my life teaching young people about history, and if history has taught us anything, it's that change happens when we refuse to stay silent. I'm not asking for apologies. I'm asking for a world where no one has to go through what I did yesterday. This is our fight." The crowd cheered, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for fairness, for dignity, for justice. Ethan went home that evening, exhausted but resolute. The fight was far from over, but it was only just beginning.